Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House Podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. Are you a good listener? Many people think that they are, but when asked what others believe, the answer can often be no. Perhaps we can all learn to be better listeners. And our guest today is here to tell us that there's no better model for how to be a good listener and to ask good questions than Jesus Christ himself. Today, we're joined by Reverend Brian Davies. Brian is the author of the new book, Captivating Conversations: How Christians Can Reclaim the Lost Art of Listening. Before we get started with our conversation, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the podcast. How can your congregation turn significant financial gifts into a long-term funding source that blesses your church for generations to come? The LCMS Foundation was created to provide professional investment services to LCMS, churches, schools, and RSOs. They've helped hundreds of congregations create, manage, and grow endowments using investments tailored to each congregation's individual needs. And now they're ready to help yours. I'd also like to thank our friends at the Continuing Education Department at Concordia University, Wisconsin. No matter where you are in life, CUW's online continuing education classes fit your schedule and connect you with a supportive community. CUW offers flexible opportunities to deepen your Bible knowledge, explore church history, and enhance your ministry skills. Invest in your personal and spiritual growth by visiting cuw.edu/continuinged to view the full course list and get started today. Now on to our conversation with Pastor Brian Davies. Brian, it's good to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Elizabeth, and to all the awesome CPH listeners. Great to connect with you again in this way.
You know, I have to say, when I prepare for these podcast episodes, I'm thinking about questions, and I'm thinking about how am I going to have a conversation with the author. And when you're talking to the author who wrote the book titled Captivating Conversations, you know, there's a little bit of trepidation there of, am I going to get the right questions to draw them out and listen?
No pressure, right? I mean, how could we have
None at all.
a title called Captivating Conversations and then have a boring podcast? That would be such a disappointment.
That would be really disappointing. So we'll see. So I'm going to throw some things out, and then I'm going to sit back and hopefully take the posture of a thoughtful listener as we chat. But it's exciting to see this new book as we head into a season where people, you know, as we look at the world around us, it seems like there's a lot of noise. And what is it you think about this world we're living in, where we're not only quick to speak and not just slow to listen, but often unwilling to listen? What do you see happening around us that has us in this position?
Oh my goodness. There's so much to say about that. I've observed it, Elizabeth, you have, and I think all of our listeners to the podcast have probably listened to it and observed it, which is everyone's talking over each other, at each other. And unfortunately, the posture we often take is, if I just say it louder or more passionately, maybe I'll convince them to change their minds. And I saw that recently on a political talk show where they had two people saying their talking points, and they just kept at each other with the same talking points over and over and over again. And then when it got really heated, they just decided to get louder and louder and more passionate. And I started to realize, is that strategy working? And the resounding answer is, it is not.
No.
So I think that journey for me started a couple years ago, observing, hey, this culture of let me just get louder and more passionate and more obnoxious sometimes, or more hurtful sometimes, is kind of becoming the prevailing wind of culture, and it is not working, and actually doesn't change minds at all.
Not at all. And I was in a conversation recently where we were talking, and this was in the context of online discourse. And the comment was made that I thought was really good of, we're not reading to comprehend, we're reading to react. And I think that's true whether we're reading something online, whether we're in a conversation, or reacting to what we're hearing coming at us from the news or wherever else.
Totally true. And I would say that's not only true for reading to respond, that's also true for listening to respond. So
absolutely.
Take a conversation, and I always think, like, in an ideal world, I don't know if this would ever work, but in an ideal world, if there was a situation of conflict, if you could establish ground rules, and the ground rules would be this: okay, you're going to say your point and your perspective, and I'm only going to try to focus on listening to you and hearing to you, and not at all focus on responding to you. Then we're going to have like a 2 to 3 minute break where there's no talking. And then I'm going to actually then use that time to formulate my response. We actually might do better, because we can tell, can't you? Like when you're in a conflict with somebody and they're not listening, they're just thinking about what they're going to say next to win the moment. And it doesn't feel good.
No, it really doesn't. And it hurts all of us, because there's a lot to learn from people that we disagree with or that we may not see eye to eye. And having that thoughtful conversation doesn't mean that we may change someone's mind, but we will learn something, and we will preserve a relationship by doing it in a kind way.
No doubt. And I've taken the posture recently that if I find that someone in my life is like just annoying to me or just rubs me the wrong way, my default used to be I'm going to distance myself from them. Actually, recently, I took the approach, I'm going to do the exact opposite and get to know them better and listen to their story and figure out why they are the way they are. And I found that it actually kind of works. That like someone that used to drive me crazy, I kind of found I'm going to push into this. And I got to hear a little more, and I understood that his personality quirks that drove me crazy had a foundation in something that I really could admire. And I started to see those personality traits differently because I knew the backstory.
And now there's a whole new perspective
100%.
Because you took that time to do that. So why, as Christians, why should we aim to do better when it comes to listening?
For so many reasons. Number one, it's because it's the approach Jesus took. And we see Jesus do this from the very beginning of his ministry. Luke chapter 2, he's in the temple as a 12-year-old boy, and we see him sitting, listening, and asking questions. What an awesome posture. We see it throughout his earthly ministry that he takes that posture. Then I always loved the book of Luke closes with the road to Emmaus. And what is he doing? He's not sitting, listening, and asking questions. He's walking, listening, and asking questions. You know, he's like, hey, what are you guys talking about? What things happen in Jerusalem? I love that question. He was at the center of it, of course, but he's asking a question because he wants them to process the answer. So number one, we got to take this posture because it's the posture Jesus himself took. Secondly, it's the posture we got to take because it is the most effective strategy, not only for building relationships, but also for sharing the gospel. We can't just project what we think someone else needs to hear. We would do way better to start with, where's this person at? What's their personal history? What are their hurts and pains? And where might the gospel kind of be an aloe for them?
We're going to dive into that particular point here in a little bit. But before we do, of all of the methods that Jesus could have taken when it came to teaching and to interacting with people, why do you think he so often chose to listen and ask these questions?
Funny you should ask, Elizabeth. I wrote a whole chapter in the book about that.
I think you gave us about 10 ways that he did this.
My favorite is, and here's my new favorite hobby, Elizabeth, and maybe you'll appreciate this. It's when culture backdoors into biblical truth, like when it stumbles on it and pretends to find it like it hasn't been there all along. You know, for example, I just heard a statistic that the most successful corporate workplaces are workplaces where affirmations outnumber criticisms 4.8 to 1. And unhealthy workplaces are the exact opposite. So that means that what did we learn? If you spend your life in a more affirming, supportive posture, you're going to have better relationships with your employees. Well, that's biblical wisdom, right? And of course,
who would have thought?
Who would have thought, right? And the same is true for listening. Adam Grant writes a book called Think Again. Totally secular book, has no foundation in faith, and discovers that the least successful strategy to change someone's mind is to tell them what to do or how to think. Because when you tell someone what to do or how to think, automatically, for some reason, it's human nature. Our posture is we feel backed into a corner. We feel like we got to explain, defend, and justify our position. A much better approach, Adam Grant, secular theologian, really, he's a theologian of culture. He observes, hey, don't tell people what to do or what to think. It doesn't work. Instead, ask questions that get to the crux of why they're doing what they're doing and is it working or not, which is the exact approach Jesus takes. So bottom line answer to your question, why does Jesus take the approach? Because he knows human nature. He created human nature. He knows how the mind works. So he's like, hey, this is going to be the best, most successful approach to helping people come around to the reality of who I am.
So as we today are taking a page out of his playbook and asking thoughtful questions, how can asking these questions not only help us build a better relationship, and you gave an example of that earlier, but how does it help us reach someone with the gospel?
I think the gospel is inherently personal, right? Like, the gospel is God coming down in Jesus Christ to each individual person, into their story, into their life, into their hurts, into their lived experiences. And I think the beauty of questions is that it gets us to discovering what those are, and it gets the person to discover what those hurts truly are. Because a lot of times people are stuffing them down or not even realizing them.
I think you do go into this too, but when you step back and you are asking questions and you're showing curiosity about the person you're speaking to, rather than, as Adam Grant says, like telling them what to think, it shows a humility on our part.
Totally.
Because talk about that a little bit more. How can, as we ask questions, how does that demonstrate a humility, which then I think would help the relationship that you're trying to build?
Yeah, I think Barna, who is a friend of CPH, has done some work with CPH over the course of time, I believe.
I think with LHM.
Oh, LHM. Thank you.
LHM.
Thanks.
All the acronyms.
Yes. Did a study on and invited non-Christians to speculate and hypothesize on a relationship with a Christian. Like, what would you want out of that person, right? And as a Christian, speculating what they would want, I would think that the non-Christian would want someone who is knowledgeable about Christianity, or could tell me all the truths about Christianity, like teach it to me, right? That's what I would speculate. But they said that the number one quality that a non-Christian wanted in a Christian was someone who comes at them without a perspective of judgment, but just actually listens to their story and sees them as a human being before coming with the answers. So I believe that tells us that the approach we got to take is not coming and leading with truth or judgment, although that's going to be a part of the story we tell, but it's going to be after we've built a relationship, after we've gotten to know them, after we've gotten to hear them story, and actually gotten permission to share the truth. And I get into the book a little bit too.
So we're talking, there's two sides to this coin. There's the questions that we're asking, and then there's the listening piece of it. So let's start with, what does it look like? What does effective questioning look like? And you've got some ideas about this in the book. So talk about OCI.
Yeah, thank you. And what I wanted to do, Elizabeth, because in the marketplace, there's a lot of listening books. In fact, like, as a person in the corporate world, Elizabeth, you've probably had like listening skills training. I've had listening skills training. I've been through it before, and frankly, it's helpful, right? We should be a good listener, and a lot of that focuses on our physical posture, things that we say, things that we do, not to do. I think that's really helpful. I would say that my book takes a different approach, and that rather than listening skills, which I think are important, I actually think much more important than that is the posture and attitude and disposition mentally we take as a listener, which is then going to be shown in the skills that we put into practice almost naturally. So I invite my readers to take a posture of, I call it OCI, which is kind of my take on CSI, the old TV show. And that's being open, curious, and inquisitive. And I think if you can take that posture into your relationships in your neighborhood, with your coworkers, with your extended family members who drive you crazy at Thanksgiving, and that is like open, meaning I am going to enter into this moment open to having my mind changed, open to I'm not going to come with a judgment or a preconceived notion about who that person is or what they think, but I'm actually going to be open to this moment being a good moment. Curious, meaning I'm actually going to take a posture of curiosity that they actually have a story to tell, that they've had lived experiences that I can learn from, that they're living a different life than I am, and that I'm curious about why they are choosing those choices that they're making or whatever. And then inquisitive, meaning I'm actually going to use questions to help discover more about them so that our relationship could be stronger. I think if you live OCI, number one, you're going to have stronger relationships. And number two, it's going to be a lot more of a fun life.
Now, I think you're right, because it will be richer.
Yeah.
You'll be able to have more stories to tell, more points of reference, more, relationships, if not stronger friendships.
Yeah. Can I give one example about that?
Please.
I'm a pastor, which means a part of my life is visiting folks that don't get out of their home much, maybe to doctor's appointments, but for varying reasons, church is difficult. Maybe they have a hard time getting there because it's early in the morning and they don't get going until late morning. Bottom line, they're homebound folks, or they're in a nursing home. They can't make it to church. So we visit them. We bring the Lord's Supper to them. Admittedly, in my ministry, those got very perfunctory. Like, every one of them looked the same. Didn't matter who I was visiting. They got the same kind of liturgy, in essence, of a devotion, a check-in, and then a distribution of the Lord's Supper, and then hey, I'll see you again next time. A couple months ago, actually now maybe a year or so ago now, I started to take a posture of open, curious, and inquisitive in those conversations. And amazingly, those shut-in visits got exponentially more interesting. Think about it. I'm a 44-year-old human being that gets to interact with people in their 90s. Okay. Do you think that it's possible that they have experienced a more interesting life than I have? Answer: yes, they have. Okay. And I started to just kind of pilot a question like, hey, Helen, you're noticing probably that our culture is becoming increasingly divided. Is this the most divided you've ever seen our culture? Well, imagine asking a 94-year-old human being, maybe who grew up in Europe in the 1940s, what's their feedback on that? Someone who lived through the 1960s, they tell you stories about what it was like then. All of a sudden, my perspectives got a lot richer. My experiences, the stories I got to hear, and I got some awesome stories told to me just because I decided to shift that posture.
Well, and I think that's a good point for all of us, where even in the mundane, as we're going about our day-to-day lives, if we do take that posture of OCI, we can learn so much.
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side, then, what does it look like to be a thoughtful listener? It's not just enough to throw out the questions, but as we sit back and listen to the responses, what does that look like?
Yeah, I, in the book, I think acronyms are helpful because they kind of, I think they help me take that concept into real life. And the acronym I use there is READ, which is reflect what I've heard until the person really clearly communicates that I accurately understand the situation, right? So like, you want to keep asking reflective questions. Like, so it sounds like this is what's going on. And then you'll know it when they're there, because they'll be like, yes, you've got it. That's exactly what it is, Then E, so read, READ. The E is emote. Like, what's the emotion that you're feeling because of this? Like, are you scared, angry, upset? Are you worried about what's to come? Like, what's the emotion? A is then I'm going to affirm something about what the person is sharing with me, or that they're taking the time to share it with me. Then finally, the D is disclose, which is, hey, and I just used this the other day. Hey, if were to have some feedback for you about that, would you be open to listening to it? And if you get the yes, I'd love to hear it. Well, that person's in a much better position to hear feedback from you because they've actually given you permission to share it with them. I think sometimes as Christians, we're so quick to run to the disclose part. We want to tell them the answer or tell them about Jesus, which is a great thing. But until we've really done the REA, I think we may be jumping the gun a little bit.
Well, and that goes back to, if you're telling someone what to think or what to believe, you're going to back them into a corner, and you're not going to have that dialogue and have that successful conversation.
Correct. So you've kind of like built a foundation so that the person is in a position, this person did take time to listen to me. They know the complete, as much as it can be, of the story. I'm in a much better position to take their feedback well and maybe even listen to it or do what they say because they actually have taken the time to hear me. They've done the work.
And it is work.
Mm-hmm.
I think our attention spans are so non-existent anymore that to take that time to have a conversation where you are in the present, your posture is in the present, you're not multitasking, you're not looking at your phone, you're not looking to see who else is in the room that you can go talk to.
Yep.
And that takes energy and it takes effort.
It does. And I think about it, it takes a lot of effort as a parent of 3 children because
yes, it does.
My default as a parent is I go into the role of, okay, I'm the parent. I have the lived wisdom. Let me tell you what to think or do. Right. But you were once, Elizabeth, a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old. Like, if your parent tells you what to do, like, you are very inclined to think or do the opposite, right? So
this is true.
I learned this as I'm thinking about how I interact with my kids. I think it made it into the book. It may not have, though. I had one of my daughters, her dearest friend, didn't make a team that she really thought she was going to make, and it was a horrible thing for her, right? And it was her closest friend, didn't go well. My first instinct was to tell my daughter what to say to her friends, right? Well, then I'm writing this book, so I'm like, I better do something better, And so I said this question, which I actually worked really well. I said, what would you want someone to say to you if you were in that position? Now, that was a question that made her really think about it. And then she came to her own conclusion, which, get this, was way better than I would have ever told her, right? Because it was in the language of a 16-year-old, right? And then she was able to deliver that message, which was way better than anything I would have ever told my daughter to say to her friend.
Well, you drew something out there by mentioning the kids. If you look in terms of how you communicate with each of your kids, I have 3 sons. You communicate differently with each of them, and each one of them needs a different approach for how you question them and how you listen. And the same thing is true when we leave our families. And it really takes energy on our part to recognize who we're talking to and how best to communicate with that person so that we can go down the path of effective questioning and listening.
No doubt. And I think, I believe this approach that's described in the book and fleshed out a lot more than we've fleshed it out kind of high level here. I think it really impacts the workplace too. And I think about, as I've interacted with my team members that I work with here at Lord of Glory, I play like a supervisory role over some people on our staff team. Like, it is very tempting for me, and it is the easy role to do the, well, here's what you should do thing. Like when you come into a conflict or when you, come into a thing that a staff member is not sure how to handle, my default is to tell them what to do. But if I'm going to practice what I wrote, it's not going to be telling them what to do, but asking thoughtful questions that invite them to reflect. And guess what? They end up in better places because they're closer to the situation and conflict and problem or uncertainty than I am. They're going to come up with a better answer. My role as a leader in their life is to do what Jesus did, which is ask questions that help them come to the reality on their own of what the best pathway is.
Absolutely true. And I think employees in the workplace, in any situation, they know when somebody isn't truly listening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can tell when you're sitting in a meeting and that supervisor, that person is like going through the motions
Yep.
rather than, so you can see it. And I think it definitely has an impact on the relationship and then the output. Uh, in the world today, we're in the midst of an election cycle right now. We're coming up on the holidays. Conflict happens. We're seeing it online. We see it happen all around us. When find ourselves in a situation of conflict, how can we take a posture of listening that helps us diffuse that and work through it in a productive way?
Yeah. Really good question. I devote a whole chapter to it because I think it's really, really, really important. And it's kind of like how to communicate and listen in the midst of a conflict. Conflict is a part of our lives. There's a gentleman by the name of Les Stroh who I love dearly. And his comment is conflict is inevitable, enemies are optional, meaning we've got to almost come to a place where we normalize disagreement in how we see things, but kind of denormalize, if that's a word, the fact that this gets ramped up to a level 10 battle royale every time we see something differently. When I was a student at Concordia Seminary, we were sent to fieldwork churches around St. Louis. And because of there had been examples of fieldwork students kind of getting triangulated in conflicts, we had to memorize kind of a mantra when we went out to these fieldwork churches. That is, when a member of the congregation would come to the seminarian and say, "Hey, what do you think about the fact that our church is doing X, Y, or Z? What does the seminary think about that?" We had to repeat a mantra, and the mantra was, "I'm only a seminarian. I don't know a lot about that yet. That sounds like something you should talk to pastor about," right? And the thought was, hey, internalize that, memorize that, and say that whenever conflict happens. So around the midst, or in the midst of 2020, when things got hot culturally here, I invited our church to kind of come up with their own mantra, and that was, when you encounter someone who has a different perspective than you do, simply say, "That's interesting. I'm not sure I see it the same way, but I'm glad we're friends." Or that's it.
Well, and that goes back
Go ahead.
that goes back to the humility
Yeah.
and being vulnerable enough to say, I either don't know enough about the
Yeah.
topic, or yeah, I may have a different perspective than you, but that doesn't mean that we can't be friends.
Right. So
And that's not hard. It shouldn't be that
it
hard.
shouldn't be that hard. And I think the good news, I think, is I think people are really fatigued by what we're seeing culturally. They want it to be different. They believe it should be different. Whenever I talk about this publicly on a Sunday morning, I get a lot of feedback that, like, yes, we need to do this. Like, so I think the good news is this approach is kind of like a stream in the desert. We're ready for it.
Well, that leads to my wrap up question. And you mentioned earlier that there's lots of resources out there, lots of books on how to listen effectively, all very secular. In a nutshell, what sets this book apart? Why are we as Christians called to be different? And how does having these intentional conversations and being a good listener help us be different for the sake of Christ?
No, so there's so much I could say about that. Let me just start by saying this. Without question, the primary move that Jesus Christ of Nazareth makes is that he is our Savior. He came down to earth as the Son of God. He lived a perfect life. He took all of our sins upon himself. He rose victoriously on Easter Sunday morning. He is primarily our Messiah. That is who he is. But if that was only his role, maybe he would have come down to earth just for a few days, lived a perfect life, died, rose again. Instead, he comes down to earth, lives, and has a public ministry that includes a whole lot of interacting with human beings and a whole lot of teaching. That includes, over the course of his ministry, 3 100 questions. So I believe that in addition to being our Savior and Messiah, he also is modeling for us a phenomenal approach to interact with humanity, to live in conflict, that I think we would actually do well to follow. So if the Christian is both justified and sanctified by the power of the Holy Spirit to become more like Jesus, if we're going to become more like Jesus, it's going to mean that over the course of our lives, as we receive the gifts he has for us, we're going to do a lot more asking of questions and a lot less truth spewing in the middle of conflict. That we're going to take time to listen like Jesus does, ask questions like Jesus does, be humble like Jesus does, take a posture of openness, curiosity, like Jesus does. And so I think the Christian is uniquely equipped to do that because, number one, we know our identity is found in Jesus Christ. It's not found in our political party or being right all the time. It's okay to find out that we're wrong sometimes because our lives doesn't depend on being right. Our life depends on Jesus Christ and his forgiveness. So I think the Christian is uniquely equipped to be light in this world of everyone talking over and at each other.
There is so much in this book that is great for, if you're reading it on your own, you're going to have a lot of things to ponder. You've set it up beautifully to use in a small group or in a Bible study because the questions at the end of each chapter, they make you think and they make you reflect on your behavior when it comes to asking questions and to listening. And it can be challenging. And I think it can definitely leave you going, oh, I can do better. Yeah. I mean, I know when I was looking through and like, I can certainly do better.
Elizabeth, when I was writing it, I felt that way. All right. When I was writing it, I felt that way. I'm like, man, if I'm putting this in the book, I got to do better at this. So I'm one of you.
It's a great read and it will challenge you and it will cause you to think. And so for our listeners today, I encourage you to take a look. We'll link to it in the show notes. Grab a copy and read it with your friends because it will in fact prompt some really captivating conversations.
Awesome.
Brian, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you. And again, shout out to the team at CPH for taking my work, which was a little rough at spots, and really making it shine. And the layout of the book, I love. I've shown this to a few people, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, it's so readable. Like it does not look academic. There's like art in it. There's conversation bubbles in it. I've never seen a book more like model in the layout what the concept of the book is, which is encouraging conversation. So kudos to your team."
Well, I will pass that along to the team, and I know they appreciate hearing that. But really, the content and the topic of the book are really important for us today. If we are going to live differently in our culture, we need to be willing to be better and to take those steps. And we're going to mess up. You know, we're going to find like today was not a good listening day, but we can always start it fresh and do it again.
That's right.
and try again.
That's right.
Thank you for your work on Captivating Conversations, how Christians can reclaim the lost art of listening. We'll link to it in the notes. Listeners, we'll see you next time. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House Podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.